Longtime Cleveland media voice Tony Grossi tried to go after Shedeur Sanders. He showed up ready to drag the young quarterback for being too confident, too media-friendly, and allegedly more focused on the spotlight than on football. But by the end of the segment, Grossi wasn't just walking his comments back. He was practically endorsing Shedeur's confidence without even realizing it. So let's break it down. Grossi's whole rant was built on the idea that Shedeur Sanders is somehow out of line for believing he could succeed in the NFL. That he's too into the media hype. Too bold. Too self-assured? But then, almost in the same breath, Grossi turns around and admits that the Browns' offense is, quote, awful. That they can't score. That their quarterback room is shaky at best. And suddenly Shedeur's belief in himself doesn't look so cocky, it looks pretty logical.
If you're into the real story and all the messy twists they don't show on highlight reels, go ahead and subscribe. And if you're sticking around to see how this Browns QB chaos plays out, you should definitely be subscribed.
This is what happens when criticism isn't rooted in facts. It collapses on itself. Grossi didn't bring stats. He didn't bring game tape. He brought vibes. And those vibes ended up exposing a bigger issue. Media narratives that twist confidence into arrogance depending on who's showing it. Because here's the thing, Shedeur Sanders didn't go out seeking the spotlight in this situation. The media came to him. He answered questions. Gave a measured, professional response. And that got spun into a click-worthy story about ego. Meanwhile, quarterbacks like Caleb Williams can talk about owning NFL teams and its moxie. Jackson Dart can drip with swagger and its leadership. But when Shedeur does it, cue the hot takes. Grossi's meltdown isn't just a bad take. It's a textbook example of how sports media bends narratives to fit preconceived ideas. He wanted to make Sanders look foolish, but instead exposed how outdated and inconsistent this style of commentary really is. And the worst part? There was no deeper football analysis. Grossi zeroed in on sacks from a preseason game, ignoring the fact that Shedeur didn't turn the ball over, stayed composed, and showed traits every NFL team wants in a rookie QB. Mental toughness, discipline, and control. The media's obsession with manufacturing controversy has always been part of the game. But in this case, the attempt to smear a rising star only highlighted how broken that system can be. Because when you contradict yourself trying to tear someone down, all you've really done is hand them the win. Stick around, because this moment wasn't just about Tony Grossi fumbling a take. It was about how badly the sports media scene needs a reset. And if this is how we evaluate quarterbacks now, it's no wonder fans are tuning out the noise and tuning into what actually happens on the field. Tony Grossi made one of the most embarrassing missteps in recent sports commentary, and it only took a few sentences. A longtime Cleveland media figure, Grossi tried to come for Shedeur Sanders. He attempted to paint Sanders as an attention-seeking, overly confident quarterback trying to insert himself into conversations he hadn't earned his way into yet. But in doing so, he not only exposed the cracks in his own logic, he unintentionally did the very thing he was accusing Sanders of, making it about personality over performance. The irony writes itself. Let's lay it out. Shedeur Sanders, a promising young quarterback with proven college success and a high NFL ceiling, was asked by the media about the struggling Cleveland Browns offense. He responded with calm confidence, saying he could help a team like the Browns. Not in a cocky way. Not with exaggeration or disrespect. Just a standard, confident answer. What you'd expect from a quarterback with leadership aspirations and talent to back it up. That's it. That's what sparked the outrage. Tony Grossi then took that clip and launched into what he clearly thought would be a sharp takedown. He framed Sanders as delusional, desperate, and arrogant. Someone chasing attention rather than showing humility. But the rant immediately fell apart. Why? Because Grossi, in the same breath, admitted that the Browns' offense is awful. He didn't say inconsistent. He didn't say developing. He called it awful. So let's get this straight. The Browns' offense is struggling to score, the quarterback situation is unreliable, and yet, when a young, confident quarterback says he'd be an upgrade, that's the problem? The logic collapses. If the offense is as bad as Grossi admits, then why wouldn't Sanders, who's had a productive college career, believe he could help? Confidence is a requirement at that position, not a character flaw. In fact, every great quarterback who's ever succeeded in the NFL has shared the exact same trait Grossi is trying to criticize: self-belief. Grossi didn't just contradict himself. He proved Sanders right. He validated the very reason Sanders should feel confident. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a self-inflicted PR wound dressed up as football commentary. And it gets worse. Grossi's criticism didn't stem from football fundamentals. There was no breakdown of Sanders' throwing mechanics, his ability to read a defense, or his pocket presence. Instead, Grossi focused on superficial metrics, like sacks taken in a preseason game, while completely ignoring the more critical metrics that actually define a quarterback's long-term success, like ball security, decision-making, and composure. Sanders, in his limited reps, didn't turn the ball over. He didn't panic. He didn't make reckless throws. He took sacks to avoid worse outcomes. And Grossi used that to diminish him? That's not analysis. That's lazy commentary rooted in bias. This is a perfect example of media personalities prioritizing narrative over nuance. And speaking of narrative, this entire controversy wasn't created by Sanders. It was manufactured around him. The media approached Sanders, asked the question, and then framed the answer as arrogance. That's not fair reporting. That's agenda-driven storytelling designed to generate clicks, not meaningful insight. Let's also talk about the glaring double standard. Because there is one. When players like Jackson Dart or Caleb Williams show swagger, the media praises it. They're called fiery, confident, born leaders. It's celebrated. But when Sanders carries himself with the same assured energy, it's twisted into arrogance. Why the inconsistency? There's no football reason. It comes down to perception, race, and how media figures are comfortable framing different personalities. The media's selective tolerance for confidence says more about them than it does about the players. And this is exactly what happened here. Shedeur Sanders didn't behave differently than his peers. He didn't ask for the spotlight. He didn't brag or take cheap shots. He gave an honest, level-headed answer to a question that he didn't even initiate. But because of how he looks, how he talks, and who his father is, the media filtered that answer through a different lens. Tony Grossi leaned into that narrative and ended up exposing just how thin his critique really was. This wasn't a football evaluation. It was a personality judgment. A commentary not on what Sanders has done, but on how Grossi feels about him. That's not journalism. That's projection. And the worst part? It wasn't even rooted in consistency. Grossi contradicted himself mid-rant. You can't bash a player for wanting to help an offense you just admitted is failing. That's not bold analysis. That's emotional venting. If anything, it revealed that Grossi's frustration with the Browns' performance had less to do with Sanders and more to do with his own exhaustion watching Cleveland quarterbacks struggle year after year. But instead of directing that frustration at the team, Grossi went after the outsider. The confident prospect. The young player with a target on his back for simply believing in himself. And it backfired. Publicly. The sports community didn't rally behind Grossi's take. In fact, most people saw right through it. Analysts, fans, and players alike recognized the contradiction. The critique didn't land. It evaporated the moment you stacked Sanders' resume next to it. This is where context matters. Sanders has shown poise under pressure. He's produced on the field. He's led teams. He's done everything you'd expect from a high-level quarterback prospect. And his confidence? It's not manufactured. It comes from doing the work. The idea that he should tone it down to appease media figures who refuse to acknowledge his credentials is absurd. That's the takeaway here. The media can't keep demanding humility while ignoring performance. If you're going to evaluate players, evaluate all of them by the same standards. Don't celebrate swagger in one quarterback while condemning it in another just because you don't like how he presents himself. This incident also exposed something else. How fast outdated narratives collapse when you shine a light on them. Grossi didn't get ratioed because people are too sensitive or too defensive. He got ratioed because his take lacked depth. Because it was so easily disproven with facts. Because people are tired of biased storytelling replacing honest sports coverage. And you know who didn't say a word while all this played out? Shedeur Sanders. He didn't post a quote tweet. He didn't drop a clip to clap back. He didn't need to. His track record did the talking. His silence was louder than Grossi's rant. Because when you know who you are and what you've done, you don't have to respond to every cheap shot. Grossi's take is going to live on for all the wrong reasons. Not because it was controversial, but because it was weak. Because it collapsed under its own contradictions. Because it showed how far some media figures are willing to go to push a narrative, even if it means ignoring the very facts they claim to stand on. And Sanders? He walks away with even more credibility, more support, more validation. Because anyone who watched that moment unfold knows exactly what it was. A failed attempt to tear someone down that only ended up lifting them higher. Now let's hear from you. Was Tony Grossi just venting, or did he cross a line with his shallow take? Is Shedeur Sanders being held to an unfair standard, Or is this just another example of sports media missing the point entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you're tired of media nonsense passing for football analysis, subscribe now. We cut through the noise and call out the bias, every single time. This story doesn't stop at Tony Grossi's misstep. It's part of a larger pattern in sports media, a playbook that's been recycled for decades. Take a young black quarterback, frame his confidence as arrogance, ignore his stats, twist his words, and then act shocked when the audience doesn't buy it anymore. Grossi just happened to be the one holding the mic when that playbook finally fell apart. Let's be clear, this wasn't just a weak segment or an uninformed take. It was a full-on broadcast of what's broken in sports journalism. Grossi's commentary didn't reveal anything about Shedeur Sanders. It revealed everything about how certain media figures still choose to view athletes. Not as players to be analyzed, but as characters in narratives they can control. And Shedeur? He refused to play the part. That's what set everything off. He didn't flinch. He didn't defer. He didn't beg for validation. He spoke like someone who knows what he brings to the table. And for some reason that still makes people uncomfortable. But let's ask the actual football question Grossi avoided. Is Shedeur Sanders qualified to evaluate the Browns' offense and say he could help? Short answer? Yes. Long answer? Absolutely. Shedeur isn't some loudmouth off the street. He's not a TikTok QB with no production behind him. We're talking about a player with real college credentials, high-level decision-making, proven leadership, and professional poise. His stat line backs it up. His tape backs it up. His demeanor backs it up. He's protected the football, limited turnovers, led comebacks, and shown maturity in the face of intense media pressure. Not just because of who he is, but because of who his father is. Do you think being Deion Sanders' son makes this media circus any easier to navigate? If anything, it puts more pressure on him to be composed, controlled, and constantly on point. And yet, despite the spotlight, Shedeur has shown nothing but professionalism. So why does a simple, confident comment suddenly become a character flaw? Because for some in sports media, especially those clinging to old-school standards, confidence is only allowed when they say it is. Tony Grossi fell right into that trap. He treated Sanders' confidence as something to be interrogated instead of respected. But the problem is, his own argument was standing on shaky ground. Let's not forget, Grossi didn't bring up decision-making. He didn't compare quarterback ratings. He didn't look at interception numbers or completion percentage. He honed in on sacks in a preseason game, a stat that, in context, tells you next to nothing without accounting for protection schemes, offensive line breakdowns, or play calling. Taking sacks isn't ideal, of course, but taking sacks instead of forcing bad throws? That's called protecting the football. It's called understanding game flow. It's called composure. And if that's what Sanders was showing, that should have been the headline. Instead, Grossi used it as a smear. That's not analysis. That's narrative spinning. And this is where it gets even more frustrating. Grossi knew the Browns' offense was a disaster. He said it. He admitted it. Which raises the real question. Why did he feel the need to defend a broken offense while attacking someone who expressed interest in helping it? This wasn't about football. It was about optics. And the optics were shaped by bias. Let's bring it back to something everyone's thinking but few in sports media will say out loud. There's a different standard for how confidence is interpreted in quarterbacks depending on who is displaying it. When a white quarterback shows swagger, he's called a gamer. When a black quarterback does the same, he's cocky, flashy, overconfident. It's not even subtle anymore. We've seen this play out with Cam Newton, with Lamar Jackson, with Justin Fields, with Jalen Hurts before he proved everyone wrong. They all got labeled too early and often unfairly because they didn't fit the traditional quarterback mold, on or off the field. And Shedeur Sanders? He's walking straight into that same storm. But here's the difference now. Fans aren't buying the narrative anymore. They've seen the pattern. They recognize the coded language. They know when a football critique is really just a personality dig wrapped in outdated expectations. That's why the backlash to Grossi's segment was so immediate. People weren't outraged because they're Shedeur superfans. They were outraged because they saw through the nonsense. They saw a seasoned media figure reduce a high-level quarterback prospect to a trope, and they called it out. Because here's what's really happening. The sports world is shifting. Players have more power. They have direct access to fans. They can post game film, stats, and interviews themselves. They don't need media personalities to shape their image. And when someone like Tony Grossi tries to do it for them, it just looks outdated and desperate. Grossi's take wasn't just bad. It was irrelevant. Because even if you strip away the emotion, the contradiction still stands. If the Browns' offense is awful, as GROSSI said, then Shedeur Sanders has every right to believe he could do better. That's not ego. That's confidence backed by tape. And it's the exact mindset that every successful quarterback has to have. Do you think Joe Burrow got where he is by being humble in press conferences? Do you think Patrick Mahomes second-guesses himself after a rough drive? NFL quarterbacks are judged not just by arm strength and decision-making, but by mentality. And Sanders has the mentality. He's been tested, scrutinized, doubted, and analyzed more than most quarterbacks before even entering the league. And he's still standing. Still calm. Still composed. The irony is, Sanders didn't even have to say much to win this battle. He just had to let GROSSI talk. Because once the clip aired, it spoke volumes. One man looked like he was holding a grudge. The other looked like he was already preparing for Sunday football. GROSSI tried to shrink Shedeur's moment into a narrative of arrogance. But in doing so, he made himself the story. And the story was this: a media figure clinging to outdated tropes, trying to control a narrative that no longer belongs to him. And that's the real shift. We're no longer in a sports era where media talking heads get to define the legacy of players before they've even taken a snap. That era is ending. The new era? It belongs to players like Shedeur. Players who speak with confidence because they've earned it. Players who let their film do the talking. Players who don't need to respond to every cheap shot, because the scoreboard, the stats, and the supporters are doing it for them. Tony GROSSI tried to bury a player with words. But the only thing he buried was his own credibility. There's something almost poetic about how Tony GROSSI's rant crumbled under the weight of its own contradiction. He wanted to frame Shedeur Sanders as the problem, a symbol of everything wrong with the new generation of athletes. But what he actually did was spotlight everything wrong with his generation of media. Because what was the core of GROSSI's frustration? Was it Shedeur's comment? No. It was control. It was narrative control slipping through his fingers. Old-school sports media built its influence on the ability to define who's ready, who's humble, who's overhyped, and who's one to watch. They shaped careers with headlines, built legacies in segments, and buried reputations before players could speak for themselves. But now, that power is evaporating, and Shedeur Sanders is part of the reason why. He doesn't need the media to validate him. He doesn't need GROSSI or any other legacy voice to give him permission to feel confident. He has the tape. He has the stats. He has the stage. And most importantly, he has the audience. That's what rattled GROSSI more than anything. Not what Shedeur said, but how confidently and effortlessly he said it. That kind of self-assuredness from a young black quarterback doesn't sit well with certain corners of the media who still expect players to earn their voice by staying quiet and deferential until someone says, "Okay, now you're allowed to speak." But Shedeur didn't ask for permission. He just answered a question honestly. And it's wild how that became the story. GROSSI tried to reframe a standard media moment as some grand act of arrogance. He exaggerated Shedeur's comment into a character flaw. He built an entire narrative around the assumption that this kid was out of line, while admitting the Browns' offense was a disaster. You can't say the offense is awful, and then clutch your pearls when someone offers to fix it. It's the intellectual equivalent of saying your house is on fire and then getting offended when someone hands you a fire extinguisher. GROSSI didn't just contradict himself. He exposed the shallow foundation of the argument he was trying to build. And here's where it all collapses. He never once addressed the actual reason Shedeur Sanders has a shot in the NFL. He never talked about the fact that Sanders excels at protecting the football. That he's calm in high-pressure moments. That he's shown mature, mistake-free football in a league where turnovers ruin careers. GROSSI zeroed in on sacks in a preseason game like that was the smoking gun. As if sacks, without the context of protection breakdowns, play calling, or timing, were somehow the only stat that mattered. It's surface-level analysis at best. At worst, it's dishonest. Meanwhile, Shedeur stayed silent. He didn't feed the cycle. He didn't escalate the story. He didn't take to social media to clap back because he didn't need to. The meltdown was already happening, just not from him. That's what leadership looks like. That's what quarterbacks do. They don't flinch when the noise starts. They let their game and their composure do the talking. And Sanders has both. But let's not pretend this is just about one bad take. Because if it were, we wouldn't still be talking about it. This stuck with people because it's symbolic. GROSSI's misstep represents the final gasp of a media approach that just doesn't work anymore. When a player shows professionalism and poise, and the media responds by trying to tear him down, it's not about that player. It's about a system that can't handle losing control over the narrative. Grossi saw a young quarterback owning his identity, speaking without fear, and instead of listening, he recoiled. That's not football criticism. That's a reflex from a media model that's losing relevance. Because fans? They've changed too. They don't just take a quote and run with it anymore. They want context. They want film. They want to know what really happened. And when they saw Grossi's segment, they didn't see a bold take. They saw a biased one. They saw an analyst more concerned with tone than tape. They saw a man defending a broken offense while bashing a player who hasn't even had a fair NFL shot yet. And they responded. Loudly. The backlash wasn't just about tone-deaf commentary. It was about fairness. About accuracy. About calling out a long-standing double standard that's shaped how certain players are perceived before they even hit the field. Grossi gave us a case study in how media missteps happen. And Shedeur Sanders? He gave us a masterclass in how to handle it. By staying calm. By staying professional. And by letting the facts speak louder than any rant ever could. So now we turn it over to you. Is this the last gasp of outdated sports commentary, or just the latest example of a media cycle that refuses to evolve? Drop your take in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you're done with biased narratives and shallow takes. This is where we break down the drama, hold the media accountable, and always bring the receipts.